are big, and race. Um, but also, I think like we can denaturalize our understandings of the struggle and like where the emphasis of things are placed. Often there's this kind of like, as I said, like we can like think a lot about the confrontations and the heroics of that and the kind of fighting. But the possibility of doing that work is like created from the kind of daily life that we lead and the relationships that we form with each other. And then, if we did liberate the city, that's the work that we'd actually be having to do, right? We wouldn't be just thinking about how to, you know, make the next confrontation or disruption. So, and I build also off of thinking from like disability movements too, about how we like are like interdependent and rely on one another for all the things that we need. Like when you're like chronically ill or disabled, you are very much faced with that, which I don't know. I have a lot to say about that in terms of the pandemic too. But for me, like that can reframe our thinking about care, and this is something you talked about this a little bit last night in a conversation we're having. But care does get kind of like thrown about as a buzzword, but the way when I talk about care, I'm thinking about like a way to like reframe care as like anti-work or something like that. I'll just bracket that for a second. So in the book, I'm gonna like reduce a couple or like 3 threads from the book into like these like kind of capsule ideas. I propose this like breakup theory of anarchism, which is and that also when I'm saying that, I think of it also as like potentially a process of grief. Like we have a lot of like grieving to do and trauma to get over or get through, not get over, but also like imagining our desires beyond the state and like rebuilding ourselves. We have to give up what we've held as like luxury, for example, and like reframe our pleasures. But also in terms of breaking up, I like literally mean in like breaking up with the situations and the relationships that don't serve you. I kind of get this out of the like affinity group model of organizing, where you come together for a project based out of affinity, and that group can dissolve when things over. Or also, it's a way to think about like where if you are working with people and you find yourself like blocking everything that they wanted to do, maybe you're in the wrong group, but also this is like an important way of thinking in our interpersonal relationships in terms of creating boundaries. Saying no to things is really important, and I think this is like a kind of operates on both levels. Like our refusals interpersonally can be refusals to like play the roles that we're expected to play. That refusal isn't just a negative thing because it opens up a space for something else to happen. And like giving ourselves kind of permission to do things, and also letting off the people that care for us, letting them off the hook a little bit. So there's this like breakup theory. The other thing I'm thinking about, and this getting more specifically to the city and like how we inhabit the city, something that has been very influential on me is I'm pulling from Samuel Delaney in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, but I'm calling it a cruising theory of anarchism. But in that book, he talks about contact versus networking, where networking is kind of like within a group and for like furthering your like career, basically, right? The way we think about it in kind of a careerist perspective. And for him, contact is something it's like something that happens across classes in public spaces, and that like the city has been developed and rebuilt over the century or more to make those moments of contact impossible, right? To like stop the possibility of them. So when we're thinking about the city from our perspective, I think it's important to think of it as spaces of encounter where these new possibilities can happen, and like how could we recode the spaces that we know against the ways that they're being used now, the way that like the current system kind of segregates our lives into our like production and our consumption, but also like segregates along racial lines. And like imagining low pressure spaces of contact, like places that don't have a high intensity commitment, like places where we can come and go. you know, and like see what happens without having to stay there for a long periods of time. So that's another thing that I want to like suggest here. And then my other strand is the what I'm calling for some reason the Mrs. Dalloway theory of anarchism, because I'm thinking about being a host and also guesting. Also, this comes to me from thinking about being a settler and also like a diasporic Jew. But yeah, so like the ideas of host and guest are really interesting to me as ways of relating to other people. And I think we can rethink the city as spaces that bring people together to do their thing, right? And like anarchism has a history of thinking about like spontaneous organizing, but there's like work in making the possibility for that organizing to take place. And then like you gotta back off to let something happen. Yeah, like so what spaces can we host things in, and like how can we also like think of ourselves as guests within spaces, and the way that we're using or borrowing and not owning things is another way to like rethink our relationship to property. And yeah, so thinking about the city a little bit more and surviving the city, the way that cities have been constructed is like a place to like hold and contain things, and it creates this boundary between, you know, the urban and the rural. The urban's like kind of a consumer space for like the products of the rural in terms of food, at least, and that creates this divide that seems insuperable. Also, a thing that I was thinking about is like when in the city, are people who identify as like city dwellers are also like often identifying themselves as like not making things or doing things, and that's like another place that we have to kind of like break down those divides, because yeah, the city is currently set up where you don't have to do the kind of like things of life that actually make life happen. So how can we think about cities in a way that's like more porous, that allows for mobility, that it's not like you just are in the city and that's your life, but like not porousness in the model of like gentrification or destroying neighborhoods, or, you know, people moving endlessly for jobs, right? Like that's obviously not a good thing. But like I'm thinking about it in the way that I think anarchism really forces us to think about working against spaces of concentration of power, and like the city currently kind of acts as that. We don't want power in permanent structures. You know, and then we talk about building the new world in the shell of the old. So in the city, if the city is that shell, what tools do we have here at our disposal that we can repurpose? And you know, make what we need rather than what they've been set up to make. What spaces can we like deviate towards these spaces of encounter that I was suggesting we could think about? Where's there a concentration that could be dispersed, like resources that can be spread around? And what are the connections that we could make? You know, maybe across different neighborhoods. But also, I'm interested in thinking about that outside, like the relationship of people in a city to outside spaces. So like not maybe thinking of the city as this unitary space. What if everyone wants different things, right, in the end? Because like when we say the city, like there's a bunch of people in there who want all the different things. And for me, that's like the basic the fundamental problem and solution, I guess, of anarchism, is like making us think about the fact that not everyone wants the same thing. And then like I guess I'll just have one more point that I'm interested in thinking about is how we can imagine like the seduction. So like maybe everyone doesn't want the same thing, but also how can we let our anarchism be seductive, right? That like brings people in, because I think that that's a problem that we have in anarchism, is like entry points and ways to connect. And I think we could like really tap into people's desires a lot of like sometimes just through like exposure to things that like people making things and building things that they didn't know they could do. So yeah, I think that's something to consider, is like the pleasures of replacing the emphasis of our life somewhere else. So yeah, that's my little spiel about thinking, and I'll turn it over to Peter.
Before I launch into my part, there's enough room for folks who are sitting comfortable sitting on the floor. There's enough room for a whole row of people here. Also, if there are folks who are not comfortable or not able to like stand for a long time or sit on the floor, I bet there's at least some people who give up their chairs. So let's see. So my most recent book is called The Solutions Are Already Here, and it's broadly about the ecological crisis. I could divide it roughly into 3 parts. The first looks at how we talk about that crisis, how we're encouraged or trained to talk about it or conceptualize it, and gives a lot of criticisms of framings that only help perpetuate the problem. Goes into, for example, why I talk about the ecological crisis and not, the climate crisis more narrowly. I want to thank whoever parked a Tesla right out front. So there's like a prop for this talk. So there's like plenty of criticism of all of these false solutions that are being marketed, and it goes into what is what's the history, what's the scope, and what are the causes of this crisis that we're facing as like a distinctly colonial crisis that is not a future thing, not a recent thing, but that's been going on for a very long time, and then really encompasses all of the crises at once. Then the bulk of the book, the largest section of the book, is either like descriptions of struggles and projects and initiatives around the world, or long form interviews with struggles and projects around the world that are either think like models, not a model in the sense of something to like reproduce anywhere regardless of context and history, but maybe better put, inspirations that if these kind of things were receiving more attention and more support and more solidarity in the face of the inevitable repression, then like all this pulling together, like this would fix things as much as things could possibly be fixed, and this would help us heal as much as we can possibly heal, and in like a long term come out from under this ecological crisis. And then the final rough section of the book kind of looks at like where to go from here, looking at things like reparations and looking at things like imagining what a world that is not reproducing this crisis might actually look like. And all of the author proceeds from the book go to anarchist and indigenous projects that gave interviews in Brazil and Indonesia. So I'm going to share kind of like a couple things as briefly as I can from like each of those 3 parts. I would love to just like vent and tangent about how, like, for example, electric vehicles are actually like also responsible for a huge amount of carbon emissions, or about how alternative energies are structurally incapable of doing anything about specifically climate change. But I think those are maybe a little bit less cogent to tonight's discussion. But if you want to hang out afterwards and like hear a rant, like just poke me and get me started. But I do, so one of the framings that I think we need to be very, very critical of, if not completely abandon, is this like a dichotomy between the urban and the rural, or a dichotomy between civilization and nature that very much lies at the heart of conservationism. So understanding that conservationism has sort of 2 major historical roots. One of them has to do with the enclosure and dispossession of the commons in the European subcontinent. So reserving forests on the one hand is like game hunting reserves for the aristocracy, but even more importantly as reserves of strategically important straight growing large reserves of timber for the naval fleets and other war machines that were entirely necessary to the colonization campaigns of various European states, which brings us to the other route, which is the same dispossession and enclosure, but on an even more accelerated and intense and genocidal scale, particularly in Africa. So that's where conservation is coming from. That's where white middle class environmentalism, that's the fountain it drinks from. And so it's very much based on this idea of protecting natural areas as though natural areas were separate from human areas, right? There are very, 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 very few ecosystems on this planet, at least on like the land, other than like the land and coastal areas, so like leaving out deep sea areas. Very, very few ecosystems on this planet of which humans are not a natural species, a natural member of, right? So we're like a part of most of the communities on this planet and have been for millennia. So like the entire idea, like when like, geologists were like, let's take this climate thing seriously and let's like, name the current geographic era the Anthropocene, or like, the climatic geological period defined by humans and human activity. What the fuck? Like humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and like never in our history have we created like a planetary scale crisis of survival. Like never. And the only times that regional ecocide has been carried out, that you'd have like a collapse of like life systems or of an ecosystem in like a tight regional area, it's only been state organized societies. So only like one small range of the entire range of like human social organization has ever been connected with this thing. But for the first time that all these major institutions are like, in practice recognizing like, okay, we are actually all human. It's only when it comes time to assign the blame or to share the blame. So the idea that humans and nature are separate it's more of an intervention than an idea, and it's an actively genocidal and ecocidal intervention, which is its only basis is in this historical project of colonialism and whiteness. So, and then just like a little bit about like the record of that, like like the news the other day was like trumpeting this study that it turns out that since so in the last 50 years, animal populations around the world have declined by 70%. I think it's fairly artificial to like separate animals from other living things, but I'm sure you'd find similar statistics, among all species of living things, that populations have decreased by roughly 70%, which is like in 50 years, like that's just fucking huge. All of the articles that I read said we need to have more conservation. We need to protect more natural areas to save the animals that are left. And none of them did, like, it took like 5 minutes of research to discover that in those same 50 years that animal populations declined 70%, conservation areas increased 500%. Mm-hmm. So they're continuing to urge us to do things that they're ensuring that we don't examine because of the frameworks and the information and the misinformation we're constantly being bombarded with, and the questions we're trained to never ask. For example, going back to this other rant, how would it even be possible in a capitalist system to introduce a new energy supply and expect that would, reduce the use of a pre-existing energy supply? Like that's like a non sequitur, as though like capitalism were a stable pie. Anyway, it's just like fucking absurd. And like that, not even like any of like the mainstream environmentalists like address that question. Sorry, it's just boils the blood. So they continue to propose these false solutions like conservationism that are based on a separation, like humans and nature, that has no basis in anything but a project designed to rule us all and exploit us all in very differentiated way with very differentiated results, but that in the long run is in fact not good for anyone who is a living thing, as opposed to an abstract system or I don't know, more of a fanboy for an abstract system than a living thing. So that definitely ties into or like supports the divide between like urban and rural, which I think we'll get into this more later, but is largely an organizational system, very, very relevant to capitalism, city space, and the countryside. I will just say, on the off chance that the room here is maybe leaning more in the direction of city dwellers, attacking a pretty common misconception that that the countryside or that rural spaces are more natural or whatever, it's important to recognize that under capitalism, urban space and rural space are equally industrialized. They're just industrialized by different industries which have different spatial needs and are producing different products. But when you drive past the endless stretching fields of the Midwest, you're driving past factories. Those are factories. Those are not, natural spaces, whatever that means. Okay.
It's 6:34.
Okay. Okay. So I want to, as concisely as possible, which is something I'm not very good at, talk about three interviews that appear in the book that I think can be good compost or whatever for the conversation that we're hoping to have. So the first of those was with a project with an initiative called Plan Pueblo a Pueblo in Venezuela, and that is that's an initiative that came really out of the guerrilla struggle in Venezuela, going back decades, that had a lot of relationships and a lot of presence in one of the more mountainous regions where there's a lot of agricultural production, but because it's mountainous and because capitalism is not very good at spaces that are more difficult to homogenize, is more small farms, more kind of gardening scale rather than large farms and plantations. And so they started creating relationships with working class neighborhoods in the cities, in a couple cities, and creating this direct relationship so that the folks in the cities could get access to good food, and I want to get back to what that means in a second. And then the people in the countrysides who are generally subjected to this, even though they're totally organized by capitalism and by industrialism, subjected to a major exclusion as regards access to resources, and so allowed them to relate directly. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people participating in this project, transporting millions of tons of food and making very real, substantive differences in their possibilities for survival and their quality of life and all the rest. Really quick, what do I mean by good food? Because it's not, and it can never be, just about the quantitative measurements. We were technocrats of the revolution. We've transported 8 million tons of food. That's up, 5% since last quarter. Because of the communities that they were a part of and creating relationships with, because of this fact that these are smaller land holdings, smaller farms, and for a whole other host of reasons, they were really fighting against and breaking out of the ways that industrialized food production, which is a failed system, by the way. If there's time, I'll get into that. But the system has already failed. We're still near the apex, but the curve is already going downwards. The ways that industrial food production carries out genocide and builds whiteness, right? So there are a very small number of food crops. Out of all of the foods that humans have cultivated throughout our history, there are a very small number of food crops that have been industrialized, whose production has been created at this industrial scale, and those consumption of those foods, especially in colonized territories like Venezuela, consumption of those foods is a part of the machinery of creating whiteness, right? So a part of their project was also, teaching folks in the cities, many of them, from the African diaspora, or many of them, indigenous folks who had been pushed off their lands, or mestiza folks, halfway between indigenous and white, teaching them or helping them to relearn how to consume a lot of these ancestral foods that if they had just been delivered a basket of them, wouldn't necessarily know how to cook, or and definitely would see them as low prestige or no prestige foods. So also getting into the complications of a country that grows a lot of food, importing a huge amount of its food from a plantation system. So very much an anti-colonial project, breaking down whiteness, and that's much more ecological in this more nuanced and like complete way of understanding that. I'd love to talk about that more, but I should move on to the next thing, which is an urban garden in Barcelona, El Quirort, which has a project La Cuina, the kitchen, which is a diasporic project. It brings together a lot of migrant folks, a lot of folks who come from other parts of the world, together with like Catalan and Spanish folks, and they look at intersections of urban gardening, food, culture, and politics. When we were talking earlier, you described it sort of like anti-cosmopolitan, which I like, because there's a way that we're taught to be, or like a mode of living that we're taught to, at the very least, desire to have access to, where we can, eat food from all over the world and like, express our complexity and express our sophistication, by, being knowledgeable about, food cultures from, so many different continents and countries and all the rest, but as a commodity, as a product that it's completely divorced, from those cultures and histories. And this, on the other hand, are, folks who have largely been uprooted from their places of origin, or, folks who are, maybe like from, Catalonia going back generations, but are also seeing the ways that, the increasing industrialization of the food supply affects their traditional food cultures. And they're sharing their histories, sharing what they know how to cook, sharing the kinds of foods that they like and they mix. And so then they're also breaking with this more like conservative environmentalism, which is like, an awareness of the territory, or a pseudo-awareness of the territory that tends to draw borders. Like, in this territory, these are the food crops that are eaten, this is the culture, as though living things don't have to migrate to survive. As though, what existed yesterday has to be our guidebook for what's going to exist tomorrow. So like this very, very interesting project that is like dealing with I think better than food sovereignty, food autonomy as a concept, in a way that is completely defined by the needs of the folks who care about those food cultures, like more than like, some rich asshole in a restaurant, and of the folks who like miss a food culture, who want to like carry it with them as much as possible, and who need to be able to like make these adaptations and blendings in order to survive. And then the final thing that I'll talk about, I interviewed this guy who like has goats and sheep, like in Barcelona, which is like a a major metropolitan area with like several million people, and so he practices la transhumancia, transhumance, technically a word in English, but I don't think it's been used in a couple centuries, which is the practice of a sort of repetitive seasonal migration, where usually maybe you'll go to the highlands in the summer and the lowlands in the winter months, often with a flock. And so it's a way that human movement has largely been shaped by and like responds to the movements needed by an ecosystem, by other species that we live with and alongside, like in this case sheep and goats. So the entire Spanish state, the entire Iberian Peninsula is a tinderbox. It is at risk of becoming, a desert in like the wasteland sense because of catastrophic wildfires. Fire, of course, is a natural part of the ecosystem, but like, states have a hard time like grasping that concept. It was largely deforested with industrialization, and then the Franco regime replanted a whole bunch of like pine species of the more like economically profitable varieties, and they just go up like that. And there's like they've found no good solution to that, but a growing network of shepherds are just like defying notions of like modernity and progress by like sticking to it, and in this case with this guy doing grazing his flock like right on the outskirts of urban areas, and like where like supposed forest space, even though I'm not sure if it really deserves to be called forest yet, that's like right up against buildings and structures, helping that forest regenerate and also exist in a healthy way that's like less vulnerable to these catastrophic fires. And then in the summer, breaking all of these concepts of like private property and boundaries and all the rest by recovering these old traditional transhumancia roots, which were like inscribed in like medieval custom and law about like okay, this might be your land, but like you don't have you can't say anything because like twice a year like you got to move these thousands and thousands of sheep and goats just have to move through it, so like live with it. And so doing that and going up to the Pyrenees for the summer, where they also do this grazing, which is very, very beneficial to the land. And so I thought those were like really interesting examples also for like kind of challenging our notions of the city as like a necessarily contained space.
We can talk a little bit and then open up for discussion. Yeah. I mean, I was just listening to you. The thread that comes through there, which is probably like the most important thing that we have to like deal with in imagining survival beyond the city, is food, right? And like I was just sitting there thinking like I don't think we even know what food really is, right? Like as you said, it's kind of been this product of colonialism and capitalism, and like those histories of divorcing people from their own foodways and like kind of introducing like the kind of food that we eat now, like white bread or whatever, as like is part of the process of also forcing people into the labor market and making it so they can't live outside of the state. So I think that's just really interesting. With the other example too of like people sharing their cultural ways, because I think in this current moment we can't think about that. Like there's so much discourse around cultural appropriation, that because so much of these cultural artifacts are commodified, that we forget that there's like sharing that can be done outside of like those like sort of property lines that is actually like beneficial and has long history outside of capitalism in the state. So those were just some things that came up to me. But I thought your examples were really helpful in terms of thinking about that movement and that like a city doesn't have to be this sort of static space, and can be repurposed in very interesting ways. So that was what I wanted to say.
I had a question for you about the cruising theory and like the idea of contact, the idea of like pushing back against the enclosure or destruction of like places of encounter. I think is like a very interesting and important area and direction for action. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about do you see contact as able to lend itself towards creating more lasting and strong relationships when that becomes possible, or do you think it's important not to like maybe instrumentalize it in that way, or not to place that expectation on it, if we're specifically thinking about like the kinds of like neighborhood relationships that could like arise in an urban context?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, because like when I'm saying this breakup theory, I'm not just like saying everything like just end everything, like a relationship that's founded on contact could be intermittent, right? So that like, I mean, that's another way of just rethinking our timelines of our relationships, why we get stuck in, like monogamous coupling, for example, when we're miserable or whatever, because we like have this like sense of like kind of consistency. But like a contact relationship could be something that you have like a strong bond over years, and like in an affinity group, like like certain things come out of it. I don't think it means that it has to be, completely ephemeral or something like that. So like to infuse that into like an organizing principle or whatever, I would just like, it's still that idea of just like kind of loosening our expectations of like when we come into contact, what that has to mean for a long-term thing. Again, like not to say we can't plan, but just that to kind of like remove the state logics of planning, where everything has to be kind of eternal, or wholesale replacements for the things that we don't want, or like top down, that kind of like thinking. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Well, do you want to sort of we're really interested in talking with you all. So do you want to like introduce like this kind of idea that will frame our discussion from your book?
So we want to talk about our ability to imagine different futures, and how important that is for projects of transformation, and how hard it is to like imagine like a really transformed city. And really, in a lot of ways, like the imagination is like a muscle, and we're given lots of imagined products in this society, but not a lot of opportunities to like imagine our own things. So in a ways, it's like frequently atrophied. So in like the last part of the book, because I think blueprints are very damaging. I think a blueprint is a very violent thing because it presupposes the power to impose the blueprint on the territory that's being mapped out. But I think imagining that same territory is a completely different kind of activity with different relationship, different assumptions, and all the rest. So instead of like describing like this is what the planet will look like under my brilliant solution, who I know enough to be able to like make proposals to the entire fucking planet. I talked about where I've been living for the past 15 years, which is Catalonia, like around Barcelona, and just kind of imagine like what the next few decades were going to look like in the best possible way. And obviously, I'm not going to go into most of that. I wanted to like name like two things. But yeah, those included kind of breaking the dichotomy of like city and countryside, as people like a lot of folks there like still have like their like the village that their grandparents are from, and in addition to that, the social movements. There have been a lot of social movements that have kind of gone into like the mountains to like set up communal gardens and like collective houses and stuff like that. And so a lot of people in Barcelona are, maybe only like 1 or 2 degrees of separation from folks, still living in like smaller towns or in more rural areas. And having those relationships is important. Like it's not enough to just simply want to, go farm in the mountains. If you don't know anyone there, you don't have like any of like the local knowledge, like no contacts, no relationships or anything like that. So it imagines like that process of people kind of pulling on these relationships in a very like patchwork form to create relationships between like say like blocks in the city and like this little village up in the mountains. Because with a lot of like agricultural work, there are moments of the year when you need a lot of help. Often that's going to be the help of like machines and capitalism and like extremely exploitative migrant labor. If we're imagining food as something meant to like sustain people rather than to like make money off of, then like that would look completely different. So everyone could live simultaneously in the city and in the mountains, but to different degrees. Like the people who want to might be in the city for most of the year, except for like these like 2 weeks when like you need like the most help in the countryside, like with the olive harvest and like the pig slaughter if you do that, or with like the grape harvest, or like the pruning of like the fruit and nut trees. And then other folks who don't like the city as much, they're in the mountains most of the time, but like anytime they need to like just be surrounded by a bunch of humans, because like sometimes you just need that, they go to the city, or like for like the good concerts and stuff like that, they like go into the city. And then there's people who are more like in the middle of this continuum, but like no one is just from the city or just from the countryside. And then one other element in all of that was in the first years of very early on in the revolution, like as soon as like the police lost control of things, we took over the port, which is like not extreme science fiction because like we've done it before, and we took over like the fuel reserves, knowing that like there wasn't going to be much more of that in the future, and we didn't want there to be much more petroleum in the future, but at the very least enough for like a few more transatlantic voyages with these ships that we'd taken over. And some of the factories in Catalonia in the automobile industry were repurposed to make parts, tools, and machinery that our comrades in Latin America were saying that they needed because of the ways that their economies have been structured, so that they're absolutely dependent on global networks of commerce far more than any industrialized global north country is. Like the US or like Europe generally, if like the global economy fell apart and like they only had access to the infrastructures in their immediate surroundings, would have like a much better chance of like reassembling things for some kind of self-sufficiency, whereas like most of these like hyper colonized countries in Latin America, for example, have are completely dependent. Would like even places that are producing a lot of food don't have the basic machinery needed to process that food into an edible form, and so they would be like faced with starvation, and that's not a coincidence. And that's also been directly in response to like revolutionary movements in those countries over the last century. So making sure that they're sort of held hostage through potential hunger. And so because there's already, and so this also isn't fantasy, because there are already There's good communication. There are relationships of solidarity between revolutionary movements in South America in particular and in Catalonia. And this whole idea of repurposing the factories isn't fantasy, because as soon as the pandemic broke out and the government was there like dithering and had no idea what to do, the workers in a couple different automotive factories in the Barcelona area took over their factories and repurposed them to make ventilator parts. So like we already know how to do these things. So I guess now we just want to like, you know, turn our collective imagination loose and just wander through the streets of Chicago. That, I don't know, does it not have cars? Is it full of like fruit and nuts trees like in the streets? Or like what does it look like? And more immediately, you had a question about this. From like that more like, you know, beautiful like longer term imagination, what are the things that we can do right now to be moving in that direction? Like what are the weaknesses in Chicago right now where we could like pick away and open up space that we get to define, or steal back resources that serve our needs?
Yeah. I mean, maybe, yeah, we could take a few minutes just to, like, to think about it, because we're just posing you this question, and but yeah, I mean, also if there's projects that people are working on that are already addressing that, that would be a really interesting thing. I think some of the stuff that May was mentioning kind of fits in that to a certain extent.